Let me start the day with a statement that we acknowledge and respect the common peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the song is this one of the Salish peoples whose historical relationship with this land continues to this day. All had a good morning on the common territory here, and it's still a beautiful morning. I think the rain's going to hit us soon, but that's all right. You know, we need a bit of this. So it's my great pleasure to have our first PhD student presentation of this academic year. So Lynn, thank you very much for volunteering, or I'm not sure whether we made you volunteer, but it's great that you come and present us your research. And as you can see here, Lynn had a global existence in her upbringing and education, being raised in Singapore, then with the BA honors from Durham University, and then MPhil from the University of Cambridge. And I just connected the dots that Lynn actually came to UVic through the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship, and first was at CAPI. So remember when we selected those, it's a great opportunity for international mobility, and obviously Lynn likes enough to stay here at UVic and pursue her PhD. So it's wonderful that we could keep you here and draw on your expertise. And I'm really curious to what you have to say about, looking at elder care from a comparative perspective and bringing your feminist political economy perspective to it, thinking about how a state organizes this extremely important field of social service and how this is reflected in the practices on the ground, by social practice. And you, with your language skills, your cultural familiarity, I think you're so well placed to do this comparative work, looking at Singapore and Taiwan. So the floor is all yours. And again, thank you for being here as our first PhD student presenter.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Oliver. I'm very honored to meet all of you who are in attendance. So I'll just share my slides with all of you and get started. Okay, so I've titled my presentation Global Devaluations of Eldercare Perspectives from Singapore and Taiwan. The intention here is to draw local and global comparisons between what I've observed in my fieldwork and perhaps what you might call global care chains. And so a brief presentation outline today, I would be briefly situating one of the chapters that I'm currently trying to draft in my overall PhD. So I am still constructing my main thesis statement for the PhD, but I have quite a clear idea of what I want to do in this current chapter that I'm drafting, which I will introduce in more detail later. So just my presentation outline to keep in mind with so that you have some structure of how the next 40 minutes or so is going to go. Yeah, so so my PhD objectives, I think there are two main objectives that I identify both with my overall thesis and this chapter that I'm trying to do. One of them obviously is empirical. So what I'm thinking about is comparing two very Confucian states in East Asian welfare familiarism. Singapore and Taiwan are both Chinese majority societies who are identified with a Confucian framework. And what I'm trying to show here is basically the final differences between two states that are usually lumped together in analysis of global care chains and care diamonds. And one other empirical contribution that I see myself making is giving an elder care specific focus for domestic work, because in most studies of domestic workers, I think the cooking, cleaning, caring is all lumped together. But what I've done is to kind of only interview those who are doing elder care at home as their primary job. And I think that does something to skills analysis at the end of the day. And the other part is theoretical in terms of feminist political economy. Obviously, I'm going to unpack the domestic category and thinking about the social construction of skills, as Pat Armstrong has said. I've not come to that part yet because that's not part of this current draft chapter that I'm thinking of, but it will be there, and it's a specific part of FPE that I think is quite important to explore as well. And as for racial capital, I think one part of the thesis is also decentering and anglophone bias to the extent that discussions of race and gender usually focuses in the anglophone context. So in that sense, I think contributing to the care work in Asia with the perspective of racial capital would be quite important. So in terms of my conceptual framework, briefly, obviously feminist political economy is a rather philosophical branch of work, but I'm trying to connect it to global studies here, which is, we are thinking about scholars like Maria Mi, Silva Federici, Nancy Fober more specifically in healthcare, Pat Armstrong also skills construction in healthcare, and I'm trying to pull all of that into the Southeast Asian context in Singapore and Taiwan, which is turning out to be very challenging but also very rewarding. And in terms of racial capitalism, this is also a very broad framework that encompasses the idea of perhaps studying Europe as an original colony, if I may phrase it that way, thinking about how very original dispossessions of gender and race come from the original so-called colonizer and how they've exported to the rest of the world. And Satnam Verli, Jodie Melamed are, I think, scholars who I first read when I was doing up my proposal and I continue to consult their thinking, whereas people like Daniel Goh and Pei Chia Lan in Singapore and Taiwan respectively, they have taken that framework and applied it to the local context in a way that I think is going to be useful for my own work. So in terms of my PhD questions overall, these are actually the research questions that I have when I defended my proposal, and they have remained pretty much the same. I anticipate them perhaps changing down the road depending on how the draft process is going, but it's not going to change by that much or fundamentally. So these are like some of the key questions that I inquire, and I think I'm going to answer them at the end of the day using some of the more specific frameworks in FPE around skills and racial capital. So just to give a kind of a context before I go into that chapter that I'm drafting. So from chapter 2 on government policy, chapter 2 of the PhD is going to set out some context in terms of the main differences. And this is just a table that I've suggested we can identify Singapore and Taiwan differences with. Final differences between how they conduct their economic nationalism. Taiwan is caught in a diplomatic struggle between mainland China, which Singapore does not, and that actually has very important effects for how it can channel its policy, how it presents its own regime to the citizens. So in terms of social welfare and welfare familialism, I've just suggested some categories that we might understand their institutional differences with, and that I would find in my interviews actually has a strong role to play in the micro differences at a household level, the decisions that people make around eldercare versus childcare. And global care chains is literally just a way to situate their commonality in terms of both are societies that rely very heavily on what we might call a migrant in the family model, which is quite a universal thing in Europe as well, which is where you hire a living caregiver for your family to care for elders. What I know is that in the Anglophone context, a lot of them are lived out. In my two cases here of Singapore and Taiwan, it's all live-in. It's compulsory live-in. They are mandated to stay with their employer for at least 2 years. So that is a very different kind of regime and scenario from global scenarios of having a migrant in the family. So my focus on today is on one chapter that I'm currently trying to draft and I'm reading on. I've tentatively titled it Choosing Who to Care for, Children versus Elderly, because I'm thinking about the decisions that working adults make when they are trying to care for both their children and their parents in the same household, and they hire a living caregiver. What happens in that dynamic? And I'm thinking about making chapter 4 and 5 about some of the thematic frameworks around foreign domestic workers, but for today I'm going to focus on the interviews that are not domestic workers, because it's only the other informant groups who speak about this dynamic, not so much the domestic workers. So very brief note on my background, as Oliver just now also kindly mentioned. I have to say that I am perhaps a bit more post-structural in my foundation, because I remember at Durham, my experience in geography was just we started by reading all this stuff that had not much structure to it. I mean, it was obviously a very good experience, but it's very different from my current political science training. So when I did my master's, it was more institutional in nature, but still very much on the qualitative sociology side. And now I think the PhD exams in comparative politics was an extremely important experience for me, where I learned how to think comparatively for the first time and get it into my head about what some of these frameworks, how they are going to matter for my research. So I welcome any advice or suggestions for bridging the gap in terms of not having my BA in political science, but doing a PhD in this department now. Right, so in terms of my focus for this draft chapter, I would say one of the things that I realized when I was reading the literature on care work in Asia is that I think there is some maybe unconscious bias or subconscious assumptions about what care work means. So there is a kind of reproductive futurism or like a childhood valorization in decisions of care. So in terms of the theory versus empirical reality, I'm thinking about whether the idea of reproductive work actually includes the elderly. That's because in government policy and sometimes in the literature as well, we talk about care work and social reproduction as including a whole host of general housekeeping chores and care work in the house. But people actually feel many conflicts or dilemmas when choosing where to devote their resources to. The usual scenario is like the sandwich generation who has a limited income and a limited amount of financial resources, and they have to choose actually whether they want to give more to the younger generation or their aged parents. And that's a dynamic that I think is quite important to investigate for what they might mean about global care chains, global care circuits, and the care diamond, which is a very well-established framework. So in terms of what kind of work is elder care, Silva Federici's thoughts really have enriched my intellectual framework here. So she says that elder care is deemed to absorb value but not to produce it. So that sentence, or when I read that, I kind of felt that perhaps comparing it with other kinds of reproductive work is very important for what we might, for how we might think about feminist political economy and skills construction later on in the thesis. So this value here is something that interests me. I don't think I have an exact answer about how to conceptualize this value, but I do know from my interviews that people obviously valorize childhood as a developmental process while they see elder care as a functional maintenance. So that's my interviews, what I found from my interviews, which I'm going to share right now. The interview data from today comes from everyone other than domestic workers. So like I said, the domestic workers actually, when I asked them about elder care versus childcare, they were actually quite uncomfortable, or they didn't really want to talk about it because they felt that they had nothing much to say. But when I asked this question to the NGO workers and the domestic employers, people who work in nursing homes, recruitment agency managers. Recruitment agency managers, I'm referring to the staff who manage the placement of domestic workers, because they are also in charge of the care training sometimes in many cases. So it was only when I put that question to the other informant groups that I got a lot of detailed responses, and choosing which interviews I want to use is still a struggle, but I think I'm getting there. So the interview data from today comes from everyone other than the first row. So this is a very busy slide here, but in terms of my interviewees' words, these are either direct quotes or I paraphrase them very closely to describe how they describe taking care of children and taking care of elderly. And the words in red, I think, are the key themes that come out from the interviews. These are literally their exact words in many cases. So the key idea here is that taking care of children versus taking care of elderly, they are fundamentally different things, easier to manage, harder to manage. In terms of what may be important for my thematic analysis in the end, I think it would be the idea of one being aspirational and one being functional, because that's really the key idea that I'm getting from all of my interviewees. Whether or not they agree with that is another story, but practically speaking or realistically speaking, they do acknowledge that in many cases when people are forced to choose, they would still go with caring for the younger generation. So in terms of expectations, what it means for parents, there is that dilemma there. And my key idea here is really thinking about how childcare versus elder care can complicate or give some nuance to how we are thinking about the skills of foreign domestic workers or the skills of care work in general, which is care work as in the term in feminist political economy. So the main idea here from my interviews is that eldercare is less important, less worthy, and less valuable. I might have to think of different ways to describe it, but right now I'm looking at the interview data and have just organized them in a way that I think is I can go off with in terms of thinking thematically around it. And I've done some draft chapters, but they still remain empirical in nature. So I'm thinking about how to bring that in with the literature more closely in terms of skills construction in particular, but also some racial capital in terms of thinking about Singapore and Taiwan's historical context of domestic servitude. So 1, 2, 3, 4 there is kind of what I found from my NVivo coding when I coded people. So accomplishment versus failure, social nurturing with functional maintenance, and children, parents, and elderly mates. I found that quite interesting because people were very unwilling to leave their children alone with the foreign maid, as they call it in local society, but they were okay with doing it for the aged parents. And I'm wondering what that means for people's ideas about valuing skills or valuing the worker's body actually, when depending on the kind of care work that they're doing. Different ideas of success for children and the elderly. So we have active versus passive ideas of what children and elderly should be. And there's a lack of relationality between the two kinds of care work in terms of they are two separate things. So people really did not see them as the same, which kind of contradicts what the government policy is saying when it tries to promote domestic workers to families, saying that this is a very good solution for all your care work in the house. But what happens when employers decide to allocate their domestic worker to things that maybe should have been paid more attention to, but didn't? So that's where I'm coming from in terms of the eldercare versus childcare tension. So some quotes here, I hope it's not too jarring, but I've highlighted the words in red that I feel are very important for describing the key themes. I've not done that for all of them because it would be too much, but some of the quotes that I feel represent some of the sub-themes are here. So in terms of nurturing versus maintenance, childhood versus elderly, people are saying things like, they are the future under protection, and they compare it with eldercare in terms of decay, deterioration, decline, whereas childhood was really about the process of rearing, or there's a developmental component to that you don't see in eldercare. And the Lynn Ng Foundation Singapore is actually one of the philanthropic organizations in Singapore which is very, very important for promoting a more charitable system of eldercare. So what Gabriel also said that I think he feels that it's a very passive component to eldercare in terms of society expects them to stay still and not expect much from the old age experience. So that is also something that I think I might be able to pull in later. So in terms of being willing to spend money on their children, I think that is also something that we might want to address. NGO workers in Taiwan said that based on their observation of people there, people really do not hesitate to spend a lot on children. And also if we look at the kind of industries that are associated with children but not the elderly, if you want to compare like perhaps educational institutions or early childhood enrichment compared to the institutional ideas for the elderly, they don't really, there's no equivalent in that sense. And I have a feeling that people in Taiwan are perhaps more aware or more reflective on that than people in Singapore, who are more inclined to accept a very anti-welfare ethos. And that has something to do with the history, which we might not get into here, but I welcome any questions on that later. So in terms of active versus passive, children and elderly, one domestic employer, she's not the only one, but many domestic employers who are working mothers and adult daughters as well, they said, they have a lot of worries and anxieties when it comes to leaving their child alone with the helper. But with the elderly, they felt that it's more of a process of just not being in their way. And I want to think about what that means for our analysis of skills in eldercare, and also in terms of racial capital when thinking about the devaluation of certain kinds of work as a form of class racism perhaps. So interestingly, Pell was actually this domestic employer who I tutored her son in geography, because when back in Singapore I did home tuition for geography and Chinese, and her son Caden was actually one of my home tuition students, which is how I asked her for an interview, because she did mention that she hired a helper for her elderly mother who was not living with them, and she also hired a helper for their own house where Caden was as well. And I realized that she didn't want to leave Caden alone with the helper, and she left the house when I was there for the tuition, because it was kind of like trusting me to be alone with the helper and Caden. That was something that I realized in hindsight. Whereas when she described in her interview to me, not just from this quote, but about how she related to caring for her own elderly mother, there were really very clear differences in terms of how she viewed the younger and older generation as someone who identifies with the sandwich generation. So another quote here, this was something that struck me quite hard at that time. So PW is one of her initials. She's a Singaporean domestic employer and family caregiver for her elderly mother. And she's also one ex-hospital administrator at a very large hospital in Singapore, one of Singapore's most prestigious hospitals in the children's ward. So when she was talking about elderly and childcare, she actually compared the scenario of a child who is terminally ill with eldercare to describe the way what that means for a parent's expectations and what they can expect. And I think this is something quite interesting from my view as a researcher. So what does that mean about, basically the child versus the elderly? And obviously not every parent is going to think that way if that happens to your child, but it's very interesting how she drew that analogy as someone who had a very illustrious career in a hospital managing the childhood emergency department. So they are two separate things. Obviously, this is something that struck me as well in terms of not viewing them as the same. And it might seem obvious that feminist political economists would feel that eldercare is uniquely different. But in terms of the local consciousness or the social awareness on the ground in Singapore and Taiwan, there is that contradiction between the care solutions presented to families and what kind of decisions families actually end up making between childhood and elderly. So the elderly caregivers, as someone at Taiwan said, they feel more relief or they feel like it's a task, but childhood is something that never ends, and they kind of keep pushing for their rights in terms of like when someone is a childhood caregiver, there's a process of feeling like there's no end to it. But when someone is an elderly caregiver and the patient passes away, there is a sense of being free. And that's, I realized that in Taiwan, and the people in Singapore weren't that elaborative on the contrast, which is also something that I might want to identify in terms of the Singapore-Taiwan differences there. This has got to do with the localization of Confucian ideology, which is perhaps in chapter 2 or perhaps in the background. So in terms of comparative perspectives overall, this is not so much about this chapter alone, but about the overall thesis. Obviously, one commonality is that the idea of women's work in feminist political economy is quite important for my overall argument in terms of care work is still women's work at the end of the day. So what Grace said here in Taiwan is applicable to both my locations in terms of only female members of the family taking charge of the care work despite the many siblings there are. One limitation of my interviews though is that I actually did not encounter male primary caregivers, but obviously they do exist, so that is one methodological oversight that my project has, which I will probably need to address in the introduction as well, because some of the females that I interviewed also said that they do know some male friends who are in that situation, although I did not encounter them in my own contact sourcing process. So that's one commonality, and the other commonality, obviously there are more, but these are the ones that I've identified for this presentation. What we might call a gendered racialized regime or allocation for eldercare in terms of the usage of foreign migrant women, which is a global thing. Ify Nakano, Glenn, Mary Romero in the context of USA and Canada also talk about the idea of foreign maids as degraded in local society where people hire them for all kinds of care work in the house. So what that does is basically giving employers a sense of entitlement and ownership over their whole body, mind and soul, because when foreign workers are hired in your home as on a live-in basis. I think what that does is sometimes it gives employers the sense of ownership over the person's whole soul, because you are defining the worker's body into the private property. And the connection between racial capital and feminist political economy, I think, might be witnessed with the connections between the logic of global housewifing and what we are doing to foreign migrant women. So global care chains, international transfer of reproductive labor, racial ethnic women, I think all of those are concepts that will matter fundamentally for my thesis at the end of the day. In terms of care work being women's work, locally we call them Singaporean man and Taiwanese lady boss. Lao Ban Yang is how the caregivers in Taiwan address their female employers, and in Singapore we usually say mom, and that is the way to connote the domestic employer, who is usually also female. So all over the world, care workers, foreign migrant women work in our homes. Again, this is a very informative slide, but I did want to spend some time here. I will go through it as quickly as I can in terms of Singapore and Taiwan differences for my thesis also, not just this project. So obviously, there will be differences between colonial history and state making, because Taiwan's is more complicated. Singapore inherited the British Westphalian regime very straightforwardly in 1819 when it was occupied under the East India Company. Taiwan has a mix of Japanese and Chinese nationalist history that makes the institutional eldercare regime more complicated in that sense. And the localization of Confucianism is something that I think has also emerged in my interviews at a household level, because Taiwanese people seem to have more authentic, if I may, for lack of a better term, and deeper Confucian affiliations. They really reflect more traditional ideologies of elderly valorization in the home. There's a stronger role for adult daughters in personal hands-on care. Singapore is very hands-off in comparison, if I may use that term. Political culture and regime, Taiwan's post-2000 democratization is very important for how subsequent care policy has played out, because in 2000, the DPP, the opposition party, won the Kuomintang, and from then on, according to what the managers say, the institutional facility managers say, it has really been a scenario of policy chaos where there's a lot of flip-flop, and they cannot identify a common direction for the liberalization of care there. What I realized in Singapore was that people are very resigned to the fact that care is going to be commodified, but they knew how their government was planning for it and some of the things that they might have to do as a family. Whereas in Taiwan, they also knew that it was going to be very liberal in nature, but they did not know what kind of long-term care policy the regime was going to be, based on the fact that it kept switching every 4 years. In terms of eldercare players in the care diamond, Taiwan government has a long-term care system that is different from Singapore, because Singapore's healthcare system is basically a financialized one. I wouldn't call it a long-term care system unless you operate at a very high level of abstraction, which I don't think is what I'm doing for my thesis. So eldercare specialization for domestic workers is also something that Taiwan has, but Singapore does not. Taiwan has an official separation for the live-in workers. They separate them by live-in caregivers and domestic helpers. So live-in caregivers are uniquely poised to do eldercare work only, at least on paper. But Singapore doesn't have an equivalent category. It just calls them domestic, and that has actually mattered more than I thought it would for my interviews as well. Eldercare culture in the home also differs. Related to the second bullet point here, is that I realized Taiwanese women are, in general, just a lot more hands-on and personally invested in the eldercare process as well, compared to Singaporean women who were able to buy themselves out with class privilege much more easily. And in terms of political culture and democratization, I've identified this difference in particular just because I think it might be more relevant to people around the table as well in terms of your research interests. So one factor that has mattered in terms of Taiwan, some of the quotes here that really contrast, right? So Francia is a domestic worker who has worked in Singapore and Taiwan before. She's been in Taiwan for very long at the time I interviewed her. So she said that Singapore just has this atmosphere where it's a king of law society and you don't do things that are subject to fine or penalties. Whereas in Taiwan, she felt a lot more free. She could take the elderly to the park wherever she wanted. But Singapore, it just didn't feel like that mobility was there out in the community. And Heidi, on the top there, is a Taiwanese domestic employer and family caregiver. I think I will end up quoting her extensively because her experience of caring for her own elderly father while managing a full-time job as a university professor tells me a lot about the differences between the localization of Confucian ideology when it comes to caring for elderly personally as an adult child, not outsourcing it, I mean. And so, but in this slide, she's talking about the problem of government instability or regime instability when she says the policy changes every 4 years and they don't actually know as a household how they might accumulate resources to plan for the liberalization of care in future. So in terms of social movements, Taiwan's democratization does affect the local scene because you are seeing scenarios where domestic workers, live-in caregivers go to the streets and lobby the government for their rights, whereas in Singapore you don't, because the law there has a very tight, it's a very strict system where any gathering, any unsolicited gathering over the size of 5 that claims to protest against the government in Singapore is actually, the government has the right to arrest you when they see that. In Taiwan, I don't think there is such a law, and in terms of the democratization, the activism of domestic workers in both locations also matter a lot, which I think is going to be in that chapter on agency that I'm thinking about down the road. But right now, one thing at a time, choosing who to care for first. So these are things that you see in Taiwan that you don't see in Singapore, just because of the, the way social movements are, social movement culture there and all of that. In terms of comparative ideas, I hope this slide is useful for thinking comparatively and globally, not just in the region, but beyond, about welfare types, Esting Anderson, and comparing East Asian welfare familiarism. I'm thinking about comparisons both within and across those categories, obviously, and then the usage of long-term care. So I think this is something that can maybe connect East and West, Asia and Europe, for example, because the meaning of long-term care here, I think, at least my sense of the literature would be, LTC is associated with a kind of citizen entitlement and people expect it. But when we say healthcare, we mean more of a resident right, got to do with territorial jurisdiction. So at what level of abstraction do we want to operate with these terms, I think would matter for how we are situating Singapore and Taiwan, and also where you come from. So to what extent is eldercare in Canada here, because we are in Victoria, comparable with the kind of regime that we see in Southeast Asia? So Canada's live-in caregiver program, for example, I'm thinking to what extent can it be compared or drawn parallels with the one in the foreign maids that I've talked about in Singapore and Taiwan? And obviously childcare versus eldercare in state policy, what kind of answers would you get if you were to ask the questions that I asked to the adult children, if you were to do them in Canada? I'm quite curious about that as well. So comparisons of eldercare institutions, for example, seniors care in BC and Shanghai, which is a paper that my supervisor co-wrote with her PI, Kendra Strauss, for their shared project as well, which I found very informative for a global north and south kind of view, and I will probably draw on that for my own ideas. So in terms of connections to CFGS, I think I'm doing okay in terms of time, right? So yeah, in terms of connections to CFGS, I'm thinking about the connection between this topic to immigration politics, to law and social movements, climate change and ecofeminism, because the idea of care work, whether figuratively or literally, is embedded in all of the work that we do here. Global histories of gender and racial capital, indigenous solidarity. This is something that I didn't get to mention in the presentation just now, but Taiwan's public discourse has an indigenous section that is quite absent in Singapore, just because of the way the governments there have chosen to delimit the population. The word indigenous in Singapore, you don't find it, although we do have an indigenous population, but the way we can talk about it is not the same as in Taiwan. So in terms of thinking about how we can think about global indigenous solidarity, in Taiwan there are some indigenous scholars there who identify a decolonization of care framework, and that may be useful for informing my own ideas about how to relate to global indigenous frameworks, especially what I've been seeing in Canada here since coming here in 2018. And obviously your research interests as well, how they connect to my presentation. I'm also quite curious to learn about them. And I think in terms of my presentation today, that's pretty much what I have. I hope I've not spoken too quickly. I tend to do that when I'm kind of presenting, because I'm afraid I won't have enough time to get what I did. So what I did prepare beforehand. So thank you for your attention. I hope that presentation is informative, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments you might have once this is over. Thank you.
Fabulous, so absolutely no worries about this. You definitely packed a lot into this. I would like to start us off, and thank you for already pointing out the connections to global studies. So again, the center's work, I think that was quite obvious, and it speaks to many regions, and probably a shared policy and social issue that you need to address, in particular in the developed world across the globe. Anyone who wants to start us off with comments or questions? Right, okay.
So I lived in Singapore for a few months at an exchange there in political science, and I was talking to my peers about this topic. So one thing that I found really interesting was we were talking about the social structures within Singapore that persuaded people to do the elder care. So there's not really a welfare system, which you mentioned, but like the way that their housing systems work, I believe you apply for housing, you have to be married, right, to get that housing, which is subsidized by the government, which makes it more affordable. And then you get also a discount if you live within 5 kilometers with your parents' home. So it's really incentivized from all of these various things. And then Singaporeans are also incentivized to have children as well, right? Because it's a lot of family planning. So yeah, I'm kind of curious about those types of social structures, because that's one main example that I'm aware of, which is the housing and how they distribute the housing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that. I think I didn't get to mention some of the contextual factors that are informing my thesis as well. In the case of Singapore, the housing model is quite important, as Sherry pointed out. In Singapore, I think the general structure there really incentivizes families to do what we might call intergenerational resource pooling. It's both economic and ideological, because the Housing Development Board there has established public housing in Singapore to be a norm. So public housing in Singapore is not like in Europe, where you think about it as a welfare thing. At least when I was in England, when I mentioned welfare housing, the clash very immediately came to me. In Singapore, it's really this structure where it connects the young and old and the middle generation. We are thinking about the adult children. So you have to be legally married to apply for a house. So many young couples actually, they apply for a house 5-6 years before they actually get registered, because that's the only way you can ballot for a public housing unit. And only 10% of the population also lives in the private market. So public housing in Singapore is really a norm. And the government has a system for public housing that also allows you to take care of your parents at the same time, because the funds that you use to pay for your house is also the one that you use to pay for your care expenses. Singapore has this thing called the Central Provident Fund, which is a national savings system, and people use that to pay for their monthly installments, and the government allows Singaporeans to come together in that system. So family members can pay for each other, whether it's your healthcare expenses or your housing expenses. So a lot of the elderly, they use their CPF savings to pay for their adult child's flat, because the cost of housing is not something that adult children can manage by themselves, the down payment and all of that. So what that does is there's a subtle rule, although no one is saying it, that means adult children have to take care of their parents under the same roof, if not nearby, when throughout their whole life in exchange for help. So it is really a intergenerational resource pooling mechanism that is pulling people to, that is kind of containerizing eldercare into the household. So it's a very genius kind of social engineering. In Taiwan, I think it looks very different. In Taiwan, I think it seems more pushed by the ideology of filial piety alone, which is, I think, a lot tighter there. But in Singapore, you have this system where the government is really pushing for the filial piety to be there, because the pragmatic logic of Singapore, I don't think organically would allow filial piety to have such a strong hold in eldercare obligations. Yeah, if that addresses the comment.
Thank you, Lynn. Abigail.
Oh, so I'm gonna ask a context question as well, because that's really interesting what you said. So I was amazed to hear that 10,000 people in Canada last year took advantage of medically assisted instruments for dying. And I was wondering, I mean, that just sort of brings up all sorts of questions about the nature of how people think about death in different cultures. And specifically, I mean, in Singapore and Taiwan, if there are differences, but from a perspective of thinking about it from a North American perspective, one of the first questions I thought of when you started about the devaluation of eldercare and the greater valuation of childcare is that we don't see, I mean, other than MAID, the medically assisted dying, we hide dying. We are a culture that hides our dying people. We hide it away from us, and that ends up creating a lot of fear around dying. And we kind of, it's not just a devaluing, it's a kind of a fear despising thinking about it. So on the one hand, I wanted to have your comments about how dying is thought of in Taiwan or Singapore, and also whether they have medically assisted dying and what you, if you're going to think about this at all. I mean, this is something maybe for an intro, a context, setting up some of your findings. But I mean, what, yeah. Lots of questions, sorry.
Oh, no, I'll very welcome and happy to answer them. Yeah, so I think in my thesis, I'm really quite set on making chapter 2 the context one, because as an East Asian scholar, I realized that you do need to give that context. So hopefully in the writing, I will be able to make that clear. But over here, in terms of dying, the general sense that I'm getting from my interviewees is that Confucian culture traditionally has very strict requirements for elderly existence. So like Heidi, the domestic employer that I interviewed just now, she did say that she has witnessed so many cases where the Taiwanese elderly actually feel like they would want to just end their life now because they are bedridden and they have nasogastric tubes and they really do not feel happy anymore. But the adult children, 6 or 7 of them, are like insisting that they just bodily support themselves. And I think we have that clash as well. In terms of hiding the dying, I think it also does exist in Singapore and Taiwan. It's probably a global thing with culturally specific manifestations, because in Asian culture we also don't really talk about death. I think things are slowly starting to change, but among the younger generation, among the older generation, it's still such a taboo. The moment you mention like doing a will or planning for like post-death plans to like people of my parents' age, for example, it's like no, like don't talk about it. So I think that still definitely does exist in Singapore and Taiwan. In terms of medically assisted dying, I think it is more accessible in Singapore than Taiwan, at least based on my project sample size. But
I would have to do a bit more background research on that, because at least based on my interviewees, I'm getting the sense that Singapore has a much more medicalized scene for elder care. So if you really want access to something like MAID, for example, you have to register, very expensive process that not everyone can afford. You have to register and get approval from all your family members, from important witnesses in your family, and then you need to get a certified doctor in Singapore to give you that euthanasia. So it's like a kind of speeding up the process of dying. In Taiwan, I've heard more stories about perhaps people kind of living on machines, not so much of their free consent, but because I think the family wants them to, or there is a stronger social expectation that they would have to do that. So I think in both societies, there is also like a culture of finding that death is a taboo topic and they want to bring it out of the picture. But in terms of finding the medical assistance to do it peacefully, I have a sense that Singapore might be more advanced. The scene in Singapore might be more advanced than in Taiwan, but yeah, so that's my overall sense. I think one thing that I should mention is in Singapore there has been a rapid rise in cases of elderly dying alone at home. So that actually also has spurred the public debate to think about death and dying in more depth, as you mentioned. So that kind of pushes back against the culture of hiding death, because recently in the past 5 years especially, there's been a lot of elderly who live with their helpers at home, and then for some reason they pass away, the helper is not there, and they only get found like months after. So those cases blow up on the news, and the public discourse has kind of questioned its own awareness about hiding death. But that is something that I think is a bit too recent to make any concrete conclusions on. Yeah, but in terms of the deaf culture, I think there are actually probably a lot of similarities that can be drawn out. Yeah.
Let's just put myself down.
Yes, thanks for the presentation. So just to follow up on the extremely funny topics that Abigail just raised, medically assisted suicide and stuff like this. So I was wondering, so I know in the West, death is heavily medicalized, right? So we have this kind of idea that how to basically invest in palliative care, and you're going to like pump like absolutely insane amounts of medication into like the dying person. So you basically die, you will most likely die completely like, like unconscious with your surroundings, unable to recognize anyone, and this is how most people die, right? And so I was wondering how does this look like in Singapore and Taiwan, right? Because so in I assume it's like this in most North American and European nations, right? But in my home country, this is very much related to how we care about the elderly, and this is how we understand that we should care about the elderly, right? So you will never pay your grandma a visit, right? You'll never call her, you'll never meet her for lunch, whatever. But if when she is in the hospital dying, you are going to pay for all the kind of like care that will keep her alive and everything. And this is how you convince yourself that you're actually caring about your grandparents or grandparents and so on. And so I was wondering whether there's something like this in Singapore and Taiwan too. The fact that we understand that medicalizing death is the only way, or is the only it's the only way or the only idea we have of caring about the elderly.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think in terms of palliative care, actually I don't think Singapore and Taiwan has an equal significance of palliative care as we find in the West, because the Confucian culture in both locations, in terms of what the elderly wants, most of them actually don't want to die in a hospital. They want to die at home. And at that stage, they're actually not thinking about whether they should be medicalized or not. They're thinking about leaving the world in the most peaceful state where they are most comfortable, and that's at home for them. So, for example, my grandfather many years ago, actually this was in 2018, so he chose to go away peacefully at home. Medical advice said that you should be in a hospital hooked up to the machines. That option was there, but he really wanted to be at home. And the family had to follow that because it's filial piety, it's the way you respect their wishes. So I don't, my sense is that I think there is a certain section in Asia that is shifting towards Western medical models and palliative care, but palliative care in Singapore and Taiwan is still very much kind of devalued even within the medical profession because doctors there feel that it's not really real kind of medical. I mean, I can introduce this book to you that I read. I didn't manage to cite it in my thesis, but I read this book from a palliative care doctor in Singapore about how trying to specialize in it itself is a challenging thing as a medical student because people will then think that, well, palliative isn't a real profession. You should go into like more plastic surgery, things that are more yeah, like his name is Jeremy Lynn. His book was in 2013. So he's a palliative care doctor in Singapore. And reading that, I think your questions then just made me realize that palliative care comparisons is also quite important because how we think about the elderly in Singapore, at least in the medical profession, also shows that perhaps it's not that valued. And I think the elderly in Singapore only are valued if they can prove themselves as very good consumers. That means the very rich elderly who can afford all sorts of things. But palliative care as a whole is not given that emphasis. And the role of Confucian culture there, the tight family culture, means that I think most elderly there actually wouldn't want to be in a hospital at the time of their death. So that also perhaps exists in the chicken and egg relationship with the situation with the status of palliative care.
If I can just one more point. That's very interesting because in the US, palliative care is one of the most lucrative careers in medicine. Right? Because of the incentive system that private healthcare has, right? Because all the useless drugs that you pump into the dying person is very expensive, right? So you charge it to the insurer, and the insurer pays you back like a hefty amount, right? So in the US, it's actually very, very one of the most.
It's even better than Botox, right? So
I just want to share like personal anecdote. When my parents first came here, they were shocked that elderly people here were sent to nursing homes. Yeah, because that was totally culturally completely ununderstandable. It was like, how could you? I mean, this is kind of like their perspective, right? But it's like, how could you not value the people who raised you in this way to send them to this foreign place to be taken care of by foreign people? Right? And then like, oh, what are you gonna? And then they were like joking too, and I was like younger, they're like, are you gonna throw me in a nursing home? And I'm just like, I don't know. I'm in high school.
Thanks for giving me the option.
I love you. Yeah. But it's like stuff like that, right? Like culturally, this kind of elderly care, like palliative care, is just not in the conversation. And like now, I think it's a little bit more accepted because social structures are changing. Like I'm talking from the Chinese perspective too, right? The one-child policy has like a lot of implications. So like now my grandfather is in like assisted living, and it's they go see him really frequently. But even here, like it seems like such a foreign concept.
But after all these fascinating questions about society's response to death, I have some very boring questions regarding policies, and that's a lot as a political scientist. I'm wondering, one is there any provision that the government supports particular daughters or relatives to take off time from work to care, or is it all the way given to foreign workers, to take care of the elderly, or is there any idea that there should be support structure in place that say that you go half time and then you take care of your elderly parents? And so is this, and the other one is, it seems there's lots of foreign workers coming in to take over this job, right? And do Taiwan and Singapore compete for the same workers? Do they draw on the same kind of pools in terms, and are there notable differences in their migration policy in terms of recruiting, lengths, payment, ease of coming to the country and getting a work visa? I'm just wondering, this dimension, if it's primarily focused on getting foreign workers in to take care of the elderly, is there any notable difference between the two countries?
Right. Yeah. So in terms of the government support,
actually there are no there's no government support for family caregivers in the sense of like part-time arrangements, because the government presents the foreign maid as the option. So that's like the solution. And any other elder care work that the family does is at their own organization. So usually it is adult daughters who end up doing it, and there are no like official provisions that say if you're caring for an elderly you can do this. I think there are some community initiatives, but it's not at the level of government in terms of making it nationalized and formalized. And then in terms of the competing for the same workers, very much so actually, because we both, Singapore and Taiwan both want Filipino and Indonesian domestic workers in particular, because they are very much seen as the best nationalities, so to speak, of domestic workers. And I think Taiwan's migration regime is more segmented into childcare and eldercare, because when they want to hire domestic workers from abroad, they make it very clear that some people can only, it's either you care primarily for elderly or you take on general housekeeping, and general housekeeping includes childcare. And in Taiwan, it's very racially segmented. So pretty much only Indonesians live in elder care, while Filipinos are in the other category. Whereas in Singapore, the domestic category applies to everyone. So they don't request that domestic workers have elder care training, because that's actually a requirement set by the Taiwan government in terms of pre-training your workers in elder care before coming. But Singapore doesn't have that requirement. So in terms of hiring, I think the population pool is the same, and we do compete with each other, but then also they set different requirements for pre-training, and then like when you have arrived here, you know, what you can do in society. Some of those are also different. Yeah.
If you give a Filipino, taker the choice, where would they rather go? Is there one more attractive than the other in terms of countries, or?
Oh yeah. So I've heard from my interviewees that at the end of the day, perhaps their experience as domestic workers is equally devalued, but on the surface, Taiwan would definitely seem like a more attractive option, because they hear more about its social mobility. The salary in Taiwan is actually higher, but then as I got to realize from my interviewees as well, in Taiwan you also pay more agency fees than in Singapore. So at the end of the day, it kind of equalizes itself out. But then at first glance, I think most domestic workers would feel more inclined to go to Taiwan first, because it's more attractive reputation-wise. Yeah.
Amanda should first. Sorry.
My question is quite general. I was just wondering what these societies, if you address this in your thesis, what they lose in devaluing elderly care and presumably elders as well.
Yeah. I think one thing that I eventually intend to mention would be the connection between the social construction of skills and the biomedicalization of aging. Because one way of thinking about your question would be how old people are valued and understood in society. And in the literature, I mean not intentionally, but at least in the literature on care work, I think perhaps, especially in Asia, that aspect of how old people are positioned in society is perhaps not given the same weight as the preoccupations about labor migration as a developmentalist state in Asia, right? So in terms of valuing the elderly, I think definitely the existing policies do paint the impression that filial piety is being sustained. But in terms of the actual quality of elder care, I think we might say otherwise, because the people in Singapore and Taiwan really feel that they are being filial by hiring like a live-in helper, and sometimes they might not realize that the elderly's old age experience can be brought up that much further. And I think one thing related to Stan's comment just now in terms of how the elderly are seen when they are about to leave the world, right, is I think perhaps the nursing home stigma, which is also related to what Sherry has said. In terms of how we value the elder care, I think in Asian cultures like Singapore and Taiwan, the physical presence of them being at home might be the more important criteria for care rather than thinking about the quality of care itself. So I'm also thinking about the connections between filial piety in Asia, which is different from the idea of family care in Canada, but they have connections in the sense of like there is a very strong nursing home stigma in the Chinese culture, whereas in Canada, for example, people don't have the same idea of filial piety or like, oh, you're abandoning me, but people also still know that they probably do not want to end up in an institution. So that how that works, I think, is also quite interesting. And in terms of what they lose, I think at the end of the day, they do lose appreciation of the elderly in general, and like what it means to actually respect elderly wishes, just because of what's happening to the care quality when you outsource it completely to a migrant in the family model. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very great presentation. And my question is about the social movement dimension that you mentioned. So I'm interested when you mentioned Taiwanese policy and law is changed a lot, right, compared to Singapore law and policy about care workers. But at the same time, you mentioned this in Taiwan, there are social movements of care workers, but in Singapore you didn't see that much. So my question is, how much the role of social movement of these care workers can influence the law and policy in Taiwan and in Singapore? So that's gonna reflect on, you already mentioned some that some worker may prefer to go to Taiwan rather than to Singapore in terms of their agency and their freedom is the same. Whether it's, it is possible or in which way this social movement from the bottom can influence law and policy in Taiwan and in Singapore. Opinions.
Yeah. Right. Thanks for asking that. I think based on my observation, although social movement is not like a chapter or something, but there it is definitely going to be a section in there where I make some comment about their differences, and my sense is that it is much more possible to influence government directives in Taiwan than in Singapore. Speaking as a Singaporean as well, the civil society in Singapore, we don't call it civil society, we call it civic society because it's based on certain boundaries. So the Singapore government has what we call out of bounds markers, OB markers, certain topics we just cannot mention. So based on that framework, the government decides what it wants to do, including NGO protests. So like in Singapore, to be able to protest against something, you need to get approval from the Ministry of Culture and Youth. That structure doesn't exist in Taiwan. So when I interviewed the Taiwan workers in through Zoom, Taiwan workers, I mean, I'm still sad I didn't get to go there physically because of the COVID strategy, but I interviewed them through Zoom. All the NGO workers, they took to the streets in a way that assume a kind of mobility that just didn't exist in Singapore. And my sense is that based on what some of the LTC managers in Taiwan say is that NGO workers in Taiwan are really having a concrete or significant effect on what the government feels it has to do to appease the population. But in Singapore, the government has this power that can't really be touched despite the kind of activism that happens. So I would say in terms of law and social movements, in Singapore it is perhaps more of a underground pocket thing where people still, there are radical people in their own circles, but it doesn't actually end up reaching the government level in the way that it does in Taiwan, because Taiwan's government has actually made concrete changes to some of their decisions over how much they want to let in live-in caregivers or not, based on their sense of how the population is responding. And added to that, because the flip-flop between the Kuomintang and the Democratic Progressive Party, KMT and DPP, the two parties there, means that they are also often thinking about how to market the policy in a way that will get them the most votes. So according to my interviewee, sometimes that just leaves concrete policy thinking out of the window because they are just thinking about what will make people vote for me. So sometimes the logic of policy coherence isn't actually there. This is something that my interviewees mentioned in Taiwan. In Singapore, I got the sense that people don't expect the government to budge, or they are not going to budge significantly, and NGO activism remains very much a containerized affair that they don't actually expect to move up to the higher level. Yeah, that's my general sense of things.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so it's also yeah, that's already positive, and I wasn't sure, and then Sam. Okay.
No, go ahead. Okay. You mentioned a quote there. It says, "Respect the old, love the young, and inherit the family tradition." Considering your So, where I was wondering, where does this quote come from? And how much, given the feminist lens that you applied to your research, I was wondering in your interviews, how much this kind of framing resonates with the women that you have interviewed. I mean, this sounds like a very male-oriented phrase. So how much do they, does this apply to them? And if this comes out in your interviews, in an unconscious or conscious way.
So this quote, 尊老爱幼，传承家风, is actually a Confucian idiom. 尊老爱幼, I mean respect the old and love the young. That's the best translation I can give as a bilingual person. That's something that is common to both societies there. So what that means is obviously you have to honor the elderly's wishes. In terms of my interviews and what I observed, I definitely felt that Taiwanese women were more innate than Singaporean women. Just because Singapore has a more hands-off approach in the house to elder care. So the Taiwanese women in my study, adult daughters, I was actually surprised at the number of daughters-in-law that were in the picture. Because in Singapore, we have gotten to this stage of liberalism that no longer requires daughters-in-law to care for their husband's parents. There's kind of like that idea that traditionally, yes, but we are kind of like a liberal modern society. So Singapore women, I mean, you still care for your own parents. Whereas in Taiwan, you know, the number of domestic workers who said they work together with the daughter-in-law surprised me because I did not find that in Taiwan. So that probably tells me something about the society there, of what it means, the traditional idea of filial piety, where women should care for their own parents, and then when they are married, it's about their husband's family. So their own brothers have to care for their own parents, and obviously if they don't have brothers, then it's probably still them, the eldest daughter. In terms of how it featured in my interviews, the Taiwan people question the gender aspect of it, but not the Singaporeans. So I'm thinking how I could phrase this in terms of so the Singaporeans in my study didn't actually question the gender allocation. Because when I asked this question to one of the Singaporean interviewees about, you know, what do you think about the idea that care work should be split equally in a household? She said that, oh, I do agree, but like you are from a different generation. You know, that's all she said. So that kind of told me that, okay, maybe it's not accepted. And in Taiwan, no adult children kind of question it, but the NGO workers did. You know, like Grace, that NGO worker, was someone who was really very vocal about the feminization of care work. But in terms of how that actually translates to family practice and government policy, I don't think we have the answer yet. But my overall comment on this phrase would be again about the localization of Confucianism, because I find that Taiwan has a deeper affiliation with that very traditional idea of female filial piety compared to Singapore, who has moved away from female filial piety to filial piety in general, in a more liberal sense. Yeah.
Thanks, Lynn, for your very thought-provoking presentation and topic. I wanted to ask you two things. One, to maybe expand a bit on your conceptual framework. So you mentioned that you have this kind of background and tradition in post-structural approaches, and I was curious if any of the thinkers that you were kind of exposed to in your early research career have influenced your thinking around this topic and these themes, and how that might connect to your lens. And there are a few terms that were interesting to me that I wanted to hear more about. You mentioned future reproduction and then reproductive futurism. So kind of curious how you see those terms and how that might link to your framework. And then the second question, if there's time, I'm curious about what's to come. So you mentioned chapter 4 will look at this framework, social constructivism, kind of elaborating that. And so I think that links to the first part of my question, how you're kind of thinking through social constructivism and those post-structural ideas. And then the creative agency, what will that potentially look like? So your chapter 4 and 5, what's what's your framework, and how does that connect to post-structural ideas, if at all? That's the first part. And then what's coming next for you for chapter 4 and 5 if you're kind of thinking ahead already? And if that's you can just choose one of those two questions if you want.
Yeah, I'll try to answer both. In terms of my framework and what impacted me, one of the first things that I read as an undergrad at Durham when I was 18 was actually Gayatri Spivak. And that reading, I did it many times again and again and again. And I think for better or for worse, that post-structural bent is always there in terms of coming to North America. I definitely realized that, okay, I think my training is more quote unquote unwieldy in comparison, because the way I wrote in the UK, that was how it was then. But here in political science, there are genres and conventions to follow, and I think trying to fit that early background that doesn't go away because it's part of your formative consciousness into this structure is always a learning process. I think I'm slowly starting to get there. So one of the things was someone like Gayatri Spivak. One of the very first things I read. Geography at Durham is a very at least my exposure of it there, isn't at all like political science, where first you have structure and then you have the frameworks. Over there, it's like Martin Heidegger, people like that, like the very first thing that you are exposed to. So I think it's like this reverse process of having to learn to put the structure there first. And in my own reading, I think I'm slowly also learning as I've been through this PhD about what that means, especially because I'm now in political science, what that means for my own work and how I need to make certain changes that perhaps don't erase my background, but still has a room for the conventions that I have to follow now. So that's one of the early things. And in terms of what comes next, I'm actually glad you asked that question because I'm also thinking about this myself. In terms of introduction and conclusion, I'm quite certain that those would be the very last things, in the dissertation process. In terms of chapter 2, I say kind of settled because I think there is still more work in terms of the contribution. But I'm quite sad that this chapter has got to be a contextual overview, a chapter that lays out the contrast. Because I feel that as someone from East Asia, you cannot assume that scholars know, because I've already gotten all these questions and curiosities about clarifying the context between Singapore and Taiwan, the context of live-in care there. So I think this chapter will be very important for that. At the same time, I'm thinking about the contribution aspect, but I've gotten the empirical part or kind of the material mostly there. This chapter I've just gone through, what's coming next in terms of chapter 4. So in chapter 3, I'm thinking about straddling racial capital and feminist political economy together with the social construction of skills towards the end. I don't want chapter 3 to be about the social construction of skills just yet, because I want to dwell a bit on the history of Singapore and Taiwan racial capital wise and what that means for the devaluation of eldercare. So that's my idea for chapter 3. And then I'm thinking that the social construction of skills, which is a specific part of feminist political economy, can be in chapter 4, where my interviews will come from the domestic workers. I thought of putting chapter 3 at the back, that that was my original plan, to have it as chapter 5. But then after some reorientation and the drafting process, I kind of thought that I I should put this chapter earlier, so I want the social construction of skills to follow after this one, after the eldercare discussion from a more historical perspective. And then chapter 5, to end on a lighter note, I think I should talk about the theme of creative agency and resistance. Digital activism is something that I found quite prominent as well, because the landscape of social movements, when FTWs use technology to participate, they really come up with a lot more things that wouldn't be possible physically, especially in the context of Singapore. So I'm thinking about this thematic structure for my thesis. Right now, it might change. There might be a few things here and there, but in terms of what's coming next, definitely I think it's more centered around the social construction of skills yet. Right now, I'm still thinking about perhaps talking historically a bit more about eldercare and then kind of transitioning into the social construction of skills aspect. Yeah.
I think I saw your supervisor nodding, so that seems. I might have missed it. I see Pang only a small. Sam,
yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. So, given the fact that domestic work in Taiwan and Singapore, or eldercare in standard Taiwan and Singapore is gendered and very well influenced by capitalism. I'm wondering what labor laws protect these international workers. Are there cases of maybe injury done at the workplace or maybe by living with others and caring for them? Are there cases of issues, for example, some violations or stuff like that? So what are there any laws that protect these workers, and what do you think is going to, for example, in Taiwan, what do you think is going to change in a few years from now?
So it's the question about how the state addresses violations.
Yeah, and even policies like yeah.
So in both Singapore and Taiwan, their government has a basic separation between public and private. So the domestic workers that I've interviewed, they are not covered under any kind of employment law, same as in the West, I think, because the domestic arena is seen as a private arena that's not governable. So that's common to both of them in Singapore and Taiwan. But then both of them have a basic Employment of Foreign Manpower Act that applies to public sector workers. So there are some cases where domestic workers in Taiwan, not in Singapore, because the regime in Singapore is that much tighter, but in Taiwan, I've realized that some of the NGOs have managed to apply the Employment Act to the domestic workers through their own efforts and a lot of overtime work when certain violations happen. So in general, the governments there don't have official labor protections law for domestic workers. They only have those for public sector workers, so people working in non-domestic sectors. In the domestic sector, there is only a basic framework that is still up to the employer to interpret. So it's a case-by-case basis. And in terms of labor violations, I think the cost of addressing labor violations is always going to be more expensive for the domestic worker because they have to lodge a formal complaint, they cannot get paid, they need to stay in the NGO while they're waiting for that to be processed. So a lot of them know that their rights are being violated, but they choose not to go forward with a complaint because the cost of doing so is not affordable. Yeah, and in terms of what's happening in Taiwan, I'm more optimistic about the situation in Taiwan, to be honest, because I think Taiwan's democratization, although there is a certain level of policy chaos, but it is working better for the NGOs there than the people in Singapore. So if things really do change or if things really do proceed in a certain happier direction, I think it's more likely to happen in Taiwan than in Singapore.
I think it come to a time to wrap up this session. So thank you very much, Lynn. Greatly appreciate, that you came in so early in the year, and I hope, it's a relatively friendly bunch, was informative for you, and you take away some of the ideas for proceeding, with your thesis. I'm really looking forward to this evolving, and I can already see, a fascinating argument to develop in your comparative perspective. And allow me, one last observation on the kind of multidisciplinary approach you take. I think can be quite instructive to see someone coming from outside of the discipline, then doing a PhD, in your case in political science, right? To also critically question some of the conceptual tools, the taken for granted assumptions, right, in this field, and in a way, through the back door, right, engage with political science literature. So I think also the center has a place to think creatively about bringing disciplines together in this format, right? I think you're a good example of how fruitful this could be. So best of luck to you, and we're looking forward to seeing the book or your thesis, probably your defense first. Yeah. No, you don't have to do it while you're here, fellows. So you've got a bit more time, but and oh, sorry, is this Fang, you want to come in, or it's only clapping? So thank you very much for joining us online, and all of you coming in. Thank you, Lynn.